Our second presentation will be offered by Nathan Tye. Nathan was supervised by Dr. Tracy Lavelle of the Department of History, and the title of his presentation will be Why I Wander So Far From Home, the Graham Brothers in the Civil War.
My research focuses on the Graham collection. It consists of personal letters from between 1861 and 1922. 29 of them were written during the Civil War by James and William Graham. It also includes additional letters from their elder brother, Elisha, who visits them in camp in 1861, and another member of their unit, William Love, who writes in 1864. The final document is interview notes with James, dating to 1922, where he recants war stories while at the American Legion. This all came to my attention through a story my grandfather shared with me when I was much younger. He told me about obscure uncles who had fought in the Civil War and just happened to have survived Andersonville, the most notorious prison during the war. The proof, he said, was in a bundle of yellowed letters that had sat in his vault for decades, but no one had ever looked at. My rediscovery of the letters 3 years ago started a process of piecing together this forgotten Civil War story. I unearthed a tale that is historically important and personally significant. The two uncles, as it turns out, are not obscure relatives, but direct ancestors. James, the younger of the two brothers, is my great-great-great-grandfather, and William was his older brother. These letters also play an important role in the study of the 7th Illinois Infantry, the brothers' unit. No set of letters or diary that covers their entire existence from 1861 to 1865 has been discovered until now. My set of letters is the most complete set that covers nearly the unit's entire history. In the fall of 1861, William and James left the family farm outside Mattoon, Illinois, and enlisted in Company B of the 7th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. My great-great-grandfather was only 19 at the time of enlistment, which was the same age I discovered the letters, so it was kind of a startling realization that I'm researching it while the same age he's going out to war. Marching under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant, they fought at pivotal battles in the Western Theater. William and James charged over the walls of Fort Donelson, held back waves of Confederate infantry at Shiloh, and tracked Confederate guerrillas down in Missouri and Tennessee. Along the way, they attended slaves' religious revivals, survived bullet wounds and then the medical treatment afterwards, and nearly rioted against corrupt Masonic merchants. William and James's parents, Jonathan and Lurana, were Kentucky natives with strong family and cultural ties to the South. William, in his first letter home, describes his family's reaction to his enlistment. He writes, "Some say it is a silly notion that has gotten to my wild, cracked brains while others say it is for some scandalous action why I wander so far from home." My current research expands on my earlier study of their motivation, William's scandalous actions. This initial study was modeled on James McPherson's landmark study of Civil War motivations for cause and comrades. I modified his framework, initial, combat, and sustaining motivation, to include a point of my own, captive motivation. And this is what I've focused on in my subsequent research this summer. On May 7, 1864, while patrolling the Tennessee River, William and James, along with 28 other soldiers, were captured. For the next 10 months, they were imprisoned in two of the worst Confederate prisons, Andersonville and Florence Stockade. My research focused on this later period in the war, and then their life directly afterwards. The brothers' captive motivations, their duty to one another, and the drive to survive helped them endure captivity. If William and James wrote letters from prison, they do not survive, unfortunately. The only commentary about prison life coming directly from either of the brothers is found in a 1922 interview conducted with James. Thus, I used other prison narratives in an attempt to reconstruct the brothers' experiences and understand their motivations in prison. Andersonville, seen here in a soldier's sketch from the collection of the New York Historical Society, was a large stockade built around a small creek filled with shelters built of scrap canvas, wood, and mud. According to James, 25,000 men were living in a space initially built for a maximum of 10,000 men when he arrived in the spring of 1864. At its peak, 33,000 soldiers fit inside this stockade, making it the 5th largest city in the South at the time. Nearly 13,000 men, over half of the population when William and James arrived, died when the prison was in operation. 5 months after their capture, William Love, another member of their unit, wrote home to their mother telling her that the boys are, quote, all well, end quote, but they are suffering for clothing and something to eat. James wrote after the war that they lived on cornmeal mash, not all the time though. Hunger filled the bellies of all the prisoners. Henry White, a Union chaplain, who was living with Union officers in prison just outside the stockade, said that when the rations were issued, the weak couldn't make it, and so other soldiers either had to get the food for them or they wouldn't survive. James was sickly, and he'd been in and out of hospitals his entire time during the war, and it is likely that his brother supported him, going to get his food, helping him out when he was sick, while they were in prison. Their duty to one another, which formed part of their combat motivation, helped them survive, but then also protect one another. As Union forces stormed south and occupied Atlanta, the Confederacy moved a majority of the prisoners to newly built prisoners farther from the front line. William and James were sent to Florence Stockade in South Carolina. Florence's population reached 15,000 at its peak, and somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000, although some estimates are as high as 6,000, soldiers died in the stockade. Sanitation was poor, rations were limited, and diseases such as scurvy were widespread. They literally built this stockade around the soldiers, and they had no housing, so they dug graves for themselves, covered it with branches and mud, and then died in these holes. Lieutenant James Crowley, also of the 7th Illinois, spent 3 months in Florence with the brothers. According to his account, they lived on 1 pint of rotten cornmeal per day and nothing else until the end of the war. Prisoners in Florence were known to slice off their fingers and toes in order to survive once gangrene or scurvy or what have you had set in. Excuse me. William and James emerged from these inhumane conditions in February 1865. The Confederates had moved them now to Wilmington, North Carolina, marched them to within 3 miles of the line, and set them free. The first thing they saw was a colored unit of African-American soldiers. They had never seen African-Americans before in Union uniforms, but they knew everything was okay because they saw the American flag above them. But even though they had survived dozens of skirmishes, hundreds of miles on the march, and 10 months in the worst Confederate prisons imaginable, the war had yet to take all it could from them. In his 1922 interview, James ends his war stories with a short but heart-wrenching image. I never saw him again alive. During their final march, William expended his remaining energy to ensure his brother's survival. Upon reaching the Union lines, they were separated forever. William had carried his brother the entire way because he was unable to march. They were separated, and William rapidly came down with typhoid fever and was sent to the General Hospital in Grafton, West Virginia. 2 weeks later, he died. He was 34. Meanwhile, James, still sick, was shipped to Benton Barracks, Missouri, to recover from his prison illnesses. William's personal effects were also making the journey west. Their widowed mother received all of William's worldly possessions shortly after. 1 forage cap, a jacket, 2 pairs of pants, a single pair of shoes, a blanket, a coat, 2 shirts, his backpack, and $75 in back pay. Lorana Graham signed the receipt with an X, and the receipt still exists. It's in the National Archives. She signed with an X because she was illiterate. Her husband passed away in 1863 while the brothers were in the field, and so for the remainder of the war, she relied on other family members to read the letters that her sons were sending her. And then, after the passing of William, she kept the letters as a memento. That's all she had left of her son, that and what had been sent home. In 1881, James and his wife Melvina moved to a small farm outside Griswold, Iowa. He was an active member of the Grand Army of the Republic, Worthington Post No. 9. The GR was the largest veterans organization created after the war. James outlived the post himself and was grandfathered into the American Legion in 1920. This summer, I discovered a collection of nearly 24 medals from Civil War veterans reunions, nearly all belonging to James and the Cass County Historical Society in Griswold. On May 22nd, 1927, 65 years after he enlisted, James passed away. The few remaining Civil War soldiers, and then all of the Spanish-American War veterans and World War I veterans, provided a full military funeral. His obituary recounted his Civil War exploits, most notably the 10 months he spent in the hellhole of the Confederacy, Andersonville Prison. His wife, Melvina, was also the last Civil War widow in Cass County, Iowa. She passed away in 1943. Williams and James's war story is no longer lost to history. In the course of this study, I uncovered the motivations of two common men thrust into uncommon circumstances, why they wandered so far from home, and how they survived their captivity. This experience speaks to the resilience of life, but also the dark side of humanity. William and James were able to rely on one another with their bonds of brotherhood and then the drive to survive, to endure the captivity and come out alive. Personally, I reconnected with my own past through the extraordinary lives of my ancestors. This is best illustrated by what I think is my most important discovery, and that's James's gravesite outside Bristol, Ireland. My family had forgotten him. We had no idea who he was. And one day when I was doing my research, I stumbled upon his tombstone in a small county cemetery, right as I was about to give up, because I hadn't been able to find it yet. This was the fourth cemetery I'd looked at. And 1,000 miles away, in Grafton National Cemetery, rests his brother. It is here that William's scandalous actions left him. He wandered 1,000 miles from home because he felt duty-bound to his country, his unit, and his little brother. And for that, he gave the ultimate sacrifice. Thank you.